The clang of blades cutting through the air, the furious roar of Vikings, and the clatter of shields echo across the surrounding hills as their army relentlessly approaches York. The Anglo-Saxon city, mighty and impenetrable, rises ahead like a slumbering giant, ready to awaken from its ancient sleep at any moment. But as the Viking chieftain surveys the fortress walls, separating his army from the coveted prize, a thought strikes him. Conquest is more than mere destruction and plunder. Conquest is power. It is establishing and maintaining control over foreign lands that have never known his rule. What does it mean for him to be more than a ruthless marauder? What will it take to transform a bloody military victory into a lasting, thriving empire? This is not merely the siege of an enemy stronghold. It is a battle for the souls of people in the future of a new land. The Viking chieftain feels the weight of history on his shoulders as the northern winds whisper promises of untold grandeur and unexpected trials. Ragnar the Immortal was born in the harsh lands of Jutland, where icy winds cut the skin like sharp blades and snow mercilessly blankets the barren ground. Son of Sigurd, a renowned Viking warrior, and Astrid, a wise and fearless woman, Ragnar grew up in a crucible of trials and hardships. From a young age, his life was marked by battles, struggle, and an insatiable thirst for honor, wealth, and power. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Ragnar was not content with the role of a mere warrior. He yearned for more. He dreamed of transforming his brute strength into something that would inspire fear and respect in all, even beyond the Scandinavian peninsula. By the age of 17, Ragnar was known as one of the bravest warriors of the northern lands. His fame was based not only on his masterful swordsmanship or the number of enemies he defeated, but also on his ruthless vision of warfare. He understood that true leadership required not just a sharp blade, but also the ability to forge the future of his people, to have his name carved in stone and in the hearts of descendants, and to build an empire that would outlast generations. He needed not only to conquer lands, but to rule them with the same ferocity and cunning he displayed in battle. Ragnar first demonstrated his outstanding leadership on a large scale during a bloody raid on the Eastern Kingdoms. Leading an army of over 1,000 warriors, Ragnar descended upon Lindisfarne, a prosperous Anglo-Saxon settlement. But what should have been another plundering raid transformed into an act of war that would forever change the course of his life. Taking the city by storm, Ragnar did not merely plunder its treasures or slaughter its enemies. He took control of the city and, for the first time, faced the harsh realities of governing a conquered territory. It was there that Ragnar realized military victory was insufficient to ensure his survival and the prosperity of his people. He needed to maintain order and impose his will, but also to understand and manipulate the complex social and political structures of the newly conquered kingdom. Over time, Ragnar earned the moniker the Immortal, not only for his incredible ability to survive the most brutal battles, but also for his astonishing skill in bending even the most defiant cities to his will. The brutality of his tactics made him a formidable opponent, but it was his strategic mind that set him apart. He did not limit himself to destroying enemy armies. He subjugated them through cunning, using the psychology of war to his advantage. His name, inspiring fear and dread, became synonymous with strength, intellect, and above all, absolute control. When Ragnar approached a new city, fear gripped its streets even before he set foot on its land. As his forces seized more and more lands, Ragnar sought to leave an indelible mark. He not only annihilated opposing military forces, but also imposed his own system of governance based on loyalty and fear. In every conquered area, Ragnar established a strict code of conduct where betrayal was punishable by death and honor was the most valuable currency. For him, war was not merely a means of enrichment, but a way to assert Viking dominance over the rest of the world. His army, vast and fierce, consisted of men who lived and died for Ragnar's honor, as if they were an extension of his own will. Ragnar's army, also known as the Sons of the North, struck terror throughout Europe. Composed of warriors trained from childhood, it was ruthless and fiercely loyal to its chieftain. Ragnar knew how to inspire his men. His tactics were as unpredictable as his ambitions. He didn't just lead, he seemed to foresee the enemy's actions with astonishing accuracy. It seemed Ragnar was endowed with a direct connection to fate, that his martial prowess was an extension of his own indomitable nature. His soldiers followed him with unwavering faith, considering him untouchable, a living legend destined never to fall. But Ragnar was not limited to brute physical force. When necessary, he became a master of diplomacy, skillfully manipulating alliances to his advantage. His cunning in negotiations was as legendary as his military victories. He understood that sometimes the best war is the one not fought, and that dominion over a land is achieved not only by force, but by controlling the minds and hearts of its inhabitants. Ragnar often used the might of his army as leverage, compelling his enemies to bow to his power without shedding more blood than necessary. However, not everyone succumbed to Ragnar's might. In the conquered lands, there were always those who fiercely resisted, challenging his dominion and striving to overthrow his despotism at any cost. And as a rule, Ragnar responded with brutality, commensurate with the strength of the resistance. He did not hesitate to set fields ablaze and raze entire settlements to the ground, but he always remembered that his goal was to conquer not only territory, but also the minds and hearts of the people inhabiting it. Ragnar understood that the greatest reward for a conqueror was not trophies, but the unwavering loyalty of those over whom he ruled. The culmination of his triumphant march was the battle for control of York. By initiating the siege of the impregnable city walls, he was not merely seizing land, but visibly demonstrating to the world the pinnacle of his power. He did not fear death, but he understood that to immortalize his name in history, he needed to conquer not only by force of arms, but also by his intellect. The ferocity of his warriors was undeniable, but it was his foresight and strategic thinking that secured his lasting place in the annals of history. Ragnar understood that the true conquest of York lay not in bloodshed and plunder, but in establishing a just rule, in leaving an indelible mark on the empire he had begun to build, a mark that would stand the test of time. The Anglo-Saxon lands trembled before the fury of Ragnar the Immortal and his invincible army. No kingdom, no fortress could feel safe as his forces advanced with unstoppable power and ferocity, like a northern storm. Ragnar did not merely conquer territories, he crushed symbols of resistance and built an empire, and every battle he fought became a legend. 3 battles, in particular, stand out during his ascent, immortalizing his name in history and demonstrating the true scale of his power: the brutal assault on the monastery, the destruction of the South Saxon city, and the crushing defeat inflicted upon King Alfred. On that morning, shrouded in thick fog, Ragnar and his warriors landed on the coast of Northumbria. The mission was crystal clear: to destroy Lindisfarne Monastery, a center of religious and cultural power, a symbol of Saxon resistance. The monastery, with its weathered stone walls and towering spires, seemed like an impregnable fortress. But Ragnar felt no fear invading a sacred place. For him, nothing was more sacred than his own power. The attack began at dawn. Ragnar ordered his men to encircle the monastery, while the Viking ships anchored offshore. The biting wind and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks created an ominous symphony of impending destruction. At Ragnar's signal, the Vikings charged forward with drawn swords and axes, breaking down the monastery doors with a roar that echoed through the surroundings. Mercy was alien to them. Defenseless monks and nuns were brutally slain, and soon fire engulfed the stone buildings, destroying sacred symbols and religious books. But for Ragnar, This was more than mere plunder. It was a warning. His invincible and insatiable army made it clear that no place would be safe as long as he sought absolute power. Despite all its brutality, this battle made Ragnar reflect. He questioned whether the true strength of his leadership was measured solely by the destruction he sowed or by how he consolidated his power after his destructive actions. In the case of the monastery, it was not enough to simply destroy everything in his path. He needed to force the region's population to bow before his might, and that required more than just plunder. Shortly after the monastery's destruction, Ragnar confronted the South Saxon city, a prosperous and well-defended metropolis with high walls and a population trained in defensive warfare. The city presented a worthy challenge for his army. But Ragnar knew that no resistance, however desperate, could stop the Viking tide. He had to act quickly, as always, and his strategy was impeccable. The city, proud of its fortifications, was unprepared for the Vikings' cunning tactics. Ragnar employed deception. First, he launched a diversionary attack to the west, burning small villages and creating a false impression that the main assault would come from another direction. As the Saxon forces dispersed to defend these villages, Ragnar and his army moved along a less protected route. The element of surprise was complete. By dawn, his warriors had already taken positions at the city gates, and when the walls began to crumble, the shock was deafening. Ragnar, an axe in each hand, led the charge with unstoppable fury. The battle turned into a bloody massacre. The city's inhabitants, gripped by panic, could not withstand the overwhelming Viking force. A slaughter ensued, a terrifying spectacle of destruction. The city streets were flooded with Vikings showing no mercy. Homes blazed with fire, markets were ruined, temples plundered. In his pursuit of absolute power, Ragnar not only destroyed but also subjugated the local population. He forced the survivors to kneel before him, proclaiming his dominion over the entire region. The city, once proud of its independence, was reduced to ruins, and Ragnar knew that his name would once again be forever etched in history as the man who destroyed and created at will. Ragnar's triumph, the incredible victory over Alfred the Great. The most intense and strategically important battle was the confrontation with the legendary King Alfred the Great. Alfred, ruler of Wessex, was renowned for his military genius and his ability to lead the Saxon people against invaders. Ragnar understood perfectly that defeating Alfred would be extremely difficult. The Saxon monarch possessed not only a well-trained army, but also strong alliances, making him a formidable adversary. However, Ragnar had an ace up his sleeve. A meticulously planned strategy. He intended to strike at Alfred's weaknesses, giving him no time to recover. For several weeks, Ragnar skillfully concealed his troops' movements, spreading false rumors of retreats and diversionary maneuvers. He sought to convince Alfred that his army was preparing to attack another city. As a result, when the clash finally occurred, Alfred was completely unprepared. Ragnar, having expertly masked his forces, surrounded the king and his warriors on a small plain near the walls of Winchester. The moment the Saxons attempted to take defensive positions, Ragnar unleashed a lightning-fast attack upon them. The battle was incredibly brutal, with both sides suffering significant losses, but Ragnar's tactical superiority lay in his strategic thinking. He understood that Alfred, despite his bravery, was inferior to him in cunning and guile. The result was a crushing defeat for Alfred. His cavalry was routed and his troops scattered, unable to withstand the furious fighting style characteristic of the Vikings. Despite the king's desperate resistance, Ragnar managed to capture Alfred, humiliating him before his people. This victory was of immense significance to Ragnar, not only militarily but also symbolically. He broke the spirit of one of the greatest Saxon rulers in history, and his name was forever remembered as the man who vanquished Alfred the Great. After Alfred's defeat, Ragnar began preparations for his greatest conquest, the city of York. The siege of York was not just another battle. York, one of the largest Anglo-Saxon cities of its time, held a strategically vital position between the north and south of England. Its capture would mean establishing complete control over trade routes and significantly expanding Viking power. Moreover, Ragnar understood that York was the heart of Saxon resistance. Conquering York would break the last stronghold against his ambitions to rule all of England. The siege began with a massive assault. Viking forces raided the city's outskirts, destroying nearby villages. Ragnar's army advanced with relentless force, breaching outer defenses and weakening the Saxon forces opposing them. However, Ragnar understood that to establish power over York, it was not enough to simply destroy the city. It was necessary to subjugate the hearts and minds of its inhabitants. Therefore, Ragnar meticulously prepared for the final stage of his triumphant march, the true conquest of York. The Siege of York, one of the most impressive battles in Viking history, was not merely a clash of armies, but a sophisticated psychological game, a grim dance between fear and resistance. Ragnar the Immortal, the great chieftain, understood that to conquer the city, he needed to break not only its physical fortifications, but also the souls of its inhabitants and warriors. Over each of the 5 days of the siege, his strategy unfolded, and the brutality relentlessly escalated. The sounds of axes cleaving flesh, the smell of fire and blood in the air, and the cries of pain echoing through the streets of York became symbols of Viking grandeur and mercilessness. The first day of the siege began at dawn, as the horizon was stained crimson by the first incendiary arrows launched at York's walls. Ragnar knew that psychological pressure could be as potent as the sword in his hand, and his initial attack aimed to undermine Saxon confidence. Throughout the night, his forces had secretly prepared in the forests and fields surrounding the city. Ragnar did not plan a frontal assault. He understood that the city was well fortified and defended by experienced warriors manning its walls. His strategy was to gradually erode the city's morale, breaking down its defenses piece by piece until resistance became impossible. With the first rays of the sun, a fiery rain of incendiary arrows descended upon the city, illuminating York's sky. Wooden towers ignited, and flames quickly spread, engulfing the first lines of defense. Ragnar watched from afar, his gaze focused, his mind calculating every move, expecting the Saxons to panic and act chaotically. He hoped that panic would grip York, and without a coordinated response, the walls could be easily breached. The plan worked. While the city was engulfed in flames, Viking forces silently advanced towards York's outer gates with ladders and battering rams. The sounds of axe blows echoed through the deserted streets. However, Ragnar understood that a frontal assault would be a mistake. Victory was to be brought not by battle, but by the sight of a defeated enemy. He spread rumors through his spies, making the Saxons believe that the real attack would come from another direction. Throughout the day, the Saxons scurried back and forth, trying to reinforce sections where there was no real threat, while Ragnar prepared for the final assault that was to take place at night. As night fell, the streets of ancient York plunged into an abyss of primal terror. Once bustling and prosperous, the city had become an arena of chaos and despair. Panic, like a contagious disease, gripped the heart of both citizens and battle-hardened warriors. Ragnar, like an ominous predator, observed the scene from his command post. He understood that a simple assault was no longer enough to achieve his goals. He had managed to break the defenders' morale, but his meticulously planned strategy lacked one crucial element. On the second day of the siege, tension in besieged York reached a critical point. Ragnar, anticipating the inevitability of fierce resistance, gave the order to prepare for the final assault. His warriors, having preserved their energy from the first day, crept through the city streets like silent shadows. They had already infiltrated York, but the city was not yet aware of the full extent of its loss. Under the cover of night, they carried out daring raids on homes and shops, ruthlessly destroying food and weapon supplies, creating an atmosphere of widespread scarcity and hopelessness. With the first rays of dawn, Ragnar ordered the opening of new fronts. Powerful catapults rained down heavy stones upon the city walls. This was not a direct assault on the fortifications, but rather an attempt to break the will to resist of the exhausted defenders. The city, trembling from the explosions and watching its once impregnable walls crack, was gripped by panic. But Ragnar understood that the most devastating blow had to be dealt to the enemy's psychology, and he fully exploited this factor. While the main forces destroyed the outer defenses, he sent a detachment of elite warriors to sow seeds of fear in the very heart of York. They began setting fire to strategically important homes and warehouses, striking buildings near the city center. Frightened civilians fled in panic through the streets, escaping the flames, while Saxon soldiers were forced to divide into small groups to contain the spread of the fire. Ragnar watched the growing chaos with a devilish grin. He knew that soon the citizens' faith in their own strength would be but a distant memory. As the second day of the siege wore on, the Viking attacks became increasingly furious and merciless. The walls crumbled under the invaders' onslaught, but Ragnar sought more. He wanted to destroy the very structure of York's power. As flames engulfed the city and panic mounted, he ordered a direct psychological attack. Viking detachments began capturing prisoners and publicly executing them in the city squares. Heads flew, beheadings were swift and efficient, all done with particular brutality to demonstrate the fate of those who dared defy Ragnar. Each dead prisoner became a clear, silent message, having a devastating effect on the citizens' morale. York was morally broken, and Ragnar understood that the next phase of the operation would be decisive. The third day marked the complete collapse of the Saxon defense. At dawn, Ragnar gave the order for a merciless assault. His warriors, like an unstoppable avalanche, moved towards the main gates, while catapults continued to hurl giant boulders at the city, crushing the stone fortifications. Ragnar knew that York's resistance would not last long. The Saxons were losing control of the situation. Their forces were scattered and demoralized. The brutality of the attack intensified with every minute, and it seemed that every movement of the Viking army suppressed any attempt at resistance. York, completely surrounded by enemies, had nowhere to run. The exhausted and hungry population began to abandon all hope of salvation. The Saxon army, once seemingly invincible, was now disorganized, leaderless, and without a clear plan of action. Ragnar again used the darkness of night for his attacks, infiltrating homes and striking in deadly silence. York's streets were drenched in blood and littered with rubble, and cries of pain echoed for miles around. The culmination of brutality came on the third day, when Ragnar ordered the capture of a group of Saxon nobles. In the midst of complete chaos, he gathered them in the central square and, before the eyes of his own troops, ordered their execution. The scene was meticulously documented by his men. Saxon nobles, one by one, fell under the blows of Viking axes, without mercy. The purpose of this act of vandalism was simple: to break all will to fight, to humiliate the Saxon leaders, and to show that negotiation was impossible. The city was on the brink of collapse, and Ragnar knew that dominion was near. By the fourth day, York was completely captured. The last surviving Saxons hid in shelters, trying to avoid a cruel fate. Ragnar understood that his goal was not just to destroy the city, but to establish complete control over it. As a final step towards subjugation, Ragnar sent his warriors to capture survivors and force civilians to kneel before him. He was not just conquering a city, he was subjugating the souls of the Saxon people. York's streets were strewn with the bodies of soldiers and civilians, and the air was thick with the smell of death. Ragnar pitched his tent in the very center of the conquered city and held a grand feast for his warriors, celebrating their victory over the Saxons. But even amidst the triumph, he understood that the capture of York was merely the beginning of his triumphant march. With an expression of absolute dominion, Ragnar surveyed the city that now belonged to him by right of conquest. Flames still consumed some areas, blood had been shed, and the city was under his undisputed control. By the fifth and final day of the siege, York was irrevocably destroyed. Ragnar proceeded to consolidate his power. Viking forces completely controlled the city, and resistance was crushed. But Ragnar was not satisfied with mere destruction. He sought complete control. He forced the remaining inhabitants to submit to his will and observe Viking laws. Ragnar was already preparing for further expansion of his conquests, and York, under his rule, was to become the center of his new empire. Ragnar's conquest of York was not merely a brief episode of plunder and destruction, but an event whose echoes were destined to resonate for centuries. His triumph lay not only in the physical subjugation of the city, but also in the broken will of the Saxon people, leaving an indelible mark not only on the ruined streets, but also in the hearts of its inhabitants. After 5 days of relentless siege that broke Saxon resistance, the once proud and prosperous York lay in ruins, stained with blood and marked by devastation. Flames still consumed the remnants of buildings, and the streets were soaked with the blood of fallen Saxon men and women. But even in this chaos, a new era was dawning. Ragnar the Immortal did not merely capture York. He began to reshape it in his own image, destroying the old order and imposing a new, equally brutal system. The city, now under his undisputed control, was to become the cornerstone of a Viking empire stretching far beyond imagination. Without losing time, Ragnar set about transforming York into a living embodiment of Viking power, a center of administration and authority reflecting the unbreakable strength of its leader. He understood that to firmly secure the conquest, it required not only the subjugation of the Saxons, but also the creation of a fundamentally new system of governance, distinct from the old. Ragnar's first step was to eradicate the former power in York, destroying every trace of Saxon rule. The few surviving Saxon leaders were publicly executed in the city's main square before a crowd of intimidated residents and captives. Saxon temples and shrines, symbols of a faith alien to Ragnar, were ruthlessly destroyed and set ablaze, leaving behind only ashes and ruins. In their place, Ragnar ordered the construction of a massive Viking fortress in the city center, a huge, impregnable, and imposing stone structure that would serve as both a palace and a center of military might. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed throughout York as the surviving inhabitants, under compulsion, built their own prison under Ragnar's rule and his ruthless laws. The new system of governance for York was established quickly and brutally. Ragnar introduced a regime of absolute control, where any act of disobedience or betrayal was punishable by death. Saxons who survived the siege were branded and forced to live by the new rules set by the Vikings, while the most loyal warriors received land and positions of power. Ragnar understood that control had to be not only military, but also psychological. Every street, every corner, and every square of York now symbolized his authority. As Ragnar's power solidified, a cultural transformation of York also took place. The city, once thriving under Anglo-Saxon culture, now became infused with Viking traditions and customs. Ragnar forbade Saxons from adhering to old beliefs, demanding their worship of Norse gods. Viking temples began to be erected in the center of York, replacing the destroyed Saxon shrines. Military festivals, previously an exclusively Viking tradition, became part of York's daily life. The city was plunged into a new cycle of brutal festivities and sacred rituals, where death and war were revered with unprecedented fervor. Young Saxons, forced to adapt to the new order, were trained in warfare from an early age. Ragnar understood that to maintain power, the next generation had to grow up as Vikings. Saxon children were taken from their parents and taught the art of Viking warfare, learning to wield axes and swords as skillfully as their conquerors. Ragnar sought not only to subjugate the Saxons, but also to create a legacy that would endure for generations, transforming York into a center of Viking power and the home of a new race of Viking-raised warriors. However, Ragnar's ambitions were not limited to merely ruling York. He dreamed of a Viking empire stretching across all of England and beyond. York was to be the starting point for his greatness, a springboard for the conquest of new lands, cities, and peoples. Ragnar dispatched emissaries and scouts to the surrounding regions to find new territories for expanding his influence. He understood that the real battle would be in uniting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under Viking rule, and York was to become a symbol of his empire's strength and might. Within months, York transformed into a center of trade and power, its streets filled with merchants, warriors, and adventurers from across the northern world. The slave trade flourished, and many surviving Saxons were sold into bondage in other kingdoms. Ragnar understood that an empire is built not only on warriors, but also on wealth, trade, and above all, control. The city was transformed, with new quarters built under the direct supervision of Ragnar and his officers. York's walls, once those of a lively city, now became a prison for those who dared to rebel. Fear enveloped the city like an impenetrable fog. Ragnar ruled with an iron fist, but understood that the city needed more than just fear. It needed loyalty. Ragnar the Immortal was confident that his deeds in York would not be forgotten. He had not merely captured a city. He had seized a symbol that would endure in history for centuries. The fall of York was clear proof of his outstanding military capabilities and ruthlessness. Ragnar understood that as long as he lived, his dominion would only grow. But the true test of his skill as a chieftain would be how his descendants would govern the city after his departure. Having conquered York, Ragnar began preparing for new battles, new conquests, and new triumphs. Ragnar's name became for the world a personification not only of war, but of an unstoppable force that could not be halted. York, now the jewel of the Viking Empire, was to illuminate Ragnar's path to eternal glory